Some men run from their past, but Abel Cotter thought he'd buried his deep enough in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. For 30 years, the old trapper lived quiet among the pines, with only his hound for company, believing the ghosts of war would never find him there. Then he discovered something growing on a dead tree that knew his name. The fleshy mass pulsed like a beating heart and whispered secrets only he should know. His dog Boone, who'd faced grizzlies without fear, backed away, trembling. Abel's gut told him to walk away and never return. But when the thing spoke of battles he'd fought and brothers he'd lost, he knew running wasn't an option anymore. What was this creature that called to him from the darkness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Abel Cotter's cabin sat tucked against a stand of towering pines, like a weathered stone in a cathedral of green. The structure bore the marks of 3 decades of mountain winters, logs chinked tight against the cold, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean, and windows small enough to keep the heat in, but large enough to watch the world beyond. This morning, like every morning for the past 30 years, Abel stood at his kitchen window with a cup of bitter coffee, watching the mist rise from the valley below. The silence up here was different from the silence he'd known in the war. During those blood-soaked years between 61 and 65, silence meant death was coming. In these mountains, silence meant peace, or it had until yesterday. Boone lay stretched across the cabin's threshold, his graying muzzle resting on massive paws. The blue-tick hound had been Abel's only companion for the better part of a decade, found as a half-starved pup wandering the timber roads. Now the dog's chest rose and fell in the easy rhythm of sleep, but Abel noticed how his ears twitched at every small sound from the forest. Yesterday's encounter had shaken them both. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd learned to live with only what he needed. A single room served as kitchen, parlor, and workshop, with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder Abel had built from lodgepole pine. Shelves lined the walls, holding mason jars of preserved food, ammunition, and the tools of a trapper's trade. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose. Abel had learned long ago that excess weight, whether in a pack or in a life, could kill a man. On the wall above his bed, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden behind a false board, lay his war medal. He hadn't looked at it in 5 years, maybe more. The tarnished bronze caught no light in its hiding place, which suited Abel fine. Some honors felt more like chains, binding a man to memories he'd rather forget. The war had taken everything from him: his younger brother Thomas, his sweetheart Mary, and his faith that men were fundamentally good. He'd enlisted with Thomas in the summer of '62, 2 farm boys from Ohio who thought they'd see some adventure and be home by Christmas. Thomas never made it past Antietam. Mary married his cousin while Abel was fighting at Chancellorsville. By war's end, Abel couldn't stomach the thought of returning to farmland that would forever echo with ghost voices. So he'd pointed his horse west and kept riding until the silence of the mountains promised. Something like peace. The morning routine had been the same for years. Coffee at sunrise, checking his trap lines by mid-morning, returning to the cabin by afternoon to skin whatever the forest had provided. Boone would range ahead on the trails, his nose reading stories Abel could never decipher. In the evenings, Abel would read by lamplight. He owned 4 books that he'd read through dozens of times: the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, a book of Shakespearean sonnets, and a practical guide to mountain survival that had saved his life more than once. But this morning felt different. The coffee tasted bitter as ash, and the familiar weight of his hunting rifle across his knees brought no comfort. Every time Abel closed his eyes, he saw that thing on the dead pine, the way it pulsed like a living heart, the unnatural warmth radiating from its surface. Worse still, he heard its voice calling his name with the familiarity of an old friend. Boone stirred at the threshold, lifting his head to stare toward the forest with eyes that held an intelligence Abel sometimes found unsettling. The dog had always been smart, but yesterday he'd shown a fear Abel had never witnessed. Boone had faced down mountain lions without backing down, had stood guard over Abel through 3 separate encounters with bears. Yet something about that growth on the tree had sent the hound fleeing. Abel rose from his chair and moved to the window that faced north, toward the ridge where the dead pine stood. Through the morning mist, he could just make out the tree's skeletal branches. Even from this distance, even knowing it was impossible, he imagined he could see the dark mass clinging to its trunk. "Just your imagination, old man," he muttered. But the words felt hollow. He'd spent the night trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Perhaps it was some kind of fungal growth, swollen with moisture from the recent rains. Mountain forests held all manner of strange life, and Abel had learned not to question nature's oddities. But fungi didn't whisper names. They didn't know about battles fought 1,000 miles away and 20 years past. The voice had been clear as church bells on Christmas morning. It had spoken of Gettysburg, of the charge up Cemetery Ridge, of the moment Abel had looked into a Confederate boy's eyes and pulled the trigger. It had known about the letter from Mary that never came, about the promise he'd made to Thomas before his brother died in a field hospital. It had known things Abel had never told another living soul. Boone rose and padded to Abel's side, pressing his warm flank against the old trapper's leg. The dog's presence steadied Abel, reminding him that some things in this world remained constant. Boone had never asked about the war, never judged Abel for the choices he'd made. The hound offered only loyalty and companionship, which was more than most men deserved. "What do you think, boy?" Abel asked, scratching behind Boone's ears. "Should we pretend yesterday never happened?" The dog tilted his head, studying Abel with those intelligent brown eyes. Then Boone moved to the door and whined. A sound Abel had learned meant the hound needed to relieve himself. But when Abel opened the door, Boone didn't bound outside as usual. Instead, the dog stepped onto the porch and immediately turned to face the forest, his hackles rising slightly. Abel followed Boone's gaze and felt his blood chill. There, carved into the bark of a pine tree not 50 yards from his cabin, was a symbol he didn't recognize. 3 intersecting circles arranged in a triangle. The mark looked fresh, the sap still weeping from the cuts. "It definitely hadn't been there yesterday." "Easy, boy," Abel whispered, though his own hand had unconsciously moved to the knife at his belt. The symbol meant nothing to Abel, but its presence felt like a violation. In 30 years, no one had come this close to his cabin uninvited. The nearest settlement was a 2-day ride, and the local Crow tribe knew these mountains as his territory. Whoever had carved that mark had done so during the night, moving through darkness with the silence of a ghost. Abel stepped back inside and retrieved his rifle, checking that it was loaded. Boone remained on the porch, but the dog had stopped growling. Instead, he seemed to be listening to something Abel couldn't hear. The forest around them had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had stilled. The silence stretched until Abel began to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing. Then, carried on air so still it might have been a whisper in his ear, came the sound of his name, Abel. This time Boone heard it too. The dog's ears flattened against his head, and he pressed himself against Abel's legs. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the canyon walls like a memory made audible. Abel Cotter. Now the voice carried weight, substance. It knew his full name, spoke it with the authority of a commanding officer or a judge pronouncing sentence. Abel raised his rifle, though he had no target to aim at. The voice seemed to originate from the carved symbol, but that was impossible. "Come back to the tree. Abel, we have much to discuss." The words faded into the mountain silence, leaving only the sound of Abel's own ragged breathing. Boone pressed closer, seeking comfort from a man who had none to give. Abel realized his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from recognition. The voice carried an accent he remembered from the war, the cultured tones of a Virginia gentleman. It sounded like Colonel Morrison, his commanding officer who died at Bull Run. But Morrison was 20 years dead, buried in a grave Abel had dug with his own hands. Abel lowered his rifle and stepped back inside the cabin, closing the door with hands that trembled despite his efforts to steady them. Boone followed, and together they stood in the familiar safety of four walls and a roof, listening to the silence that had once meant peace, but now felt heavy with threat. Whatever had spoken, his name was connected to that thing on the dead pine. Abel was certain of it. The growth had been bad enough, but this voice made it personal. Someone, or something, knew who he was, knew where he lived, and had business with him that couldn't wait. Abel sat heavily in his chair and buried his face in his hands. For 30 years, he'd believed the war was behind him. He'd convinced himself that distance and time could bury the past as surely as dirt buried the dead. But the past, it seemed, had finally found him in these mountains. Outside, the forest remained silent. Inside, Abel Cotter prepared himself for a fight he'd hoped never to face again. Abel spent the morning cleaning his rifle and sharpening his knives, the familiar rituals calming his nerves, but not silencing the questions that gnawed at him. By noon the voice hadn't returned, and the forest had resumed its normal symphony of bird calls and rustling leaves. Still, Abel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a choice. That choice became inevitable when Boone refused his afternoon meal. The dog had always been a reliable eater, but today he simply stared at the bowl of jerky and cornmeal mush that had been his standard fare for years. Instead, Boone kept moving to the door and whining, his eyes fixed on the path that led toward the ridge. It was as if the hound understood something Abel was trying to ignore, that running away wasn't an option this time. "You think we need to go back there, don't you?" Abel asked, and Boone's tail gave a single, solemn wag. Abel retrieved his grandfather's hunting knife from the wooden chest beneath his bed. The bone handle was yellowed with age and worn smooth by generations of Cotter hands. His grandfather had carried it during the Indian Wars. His father had used it to butcher hogs on their Ohio farm, and Abel had worn it through 4 years of Confederate prisons and Union camps. The blade was 8 inches of good steel, kept sharp enough to shave with. If he was going to face whatever waited at that tree, he wanted his family's blade at his side. The walk to the ridge took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Boone ranged ahead, but his usual enthusiasm for exploring was replaced by a grim determination that matched Abel's own mood. The dog would stop every few yards to look back, as if ensuring Abel was still following, then continue up the rocky path, with his nose low to the ground. The dead pine came into view just as the afternoon sun reached its peak. From a distance, Abel could see the dark mass still clinging to the trunk, but something had changed. The growth appeared larger than before, more defined in its shape. What had been roughly oval yesterday now showed disturbing details, ridges that looked like ribs, a depression that might have been a mouth, and worst of all, a rhythmic movement that left no doubt it was breathing. Boone stopped 50 feet from the tree and refused to go further. The dog sat on his haunches and whined, his entire body trembling with suppressed fear. Abel had never seen his companion so agitated, not even during their encounter with a wounded grizzly 2 springs ago. "Stay here, boy," Abel whispered. Though he doubted Boone needed the instruction, Abel approached the tree with his rifle ready, though he wasn't sure bullets would do any good against whatever this thing was. Up close, the growth was even more disturbing than memory had painted it. The surface wasn't smooth like tree fungus, but textured like skin, complete with what looked like pores that opened and closed with each breath. Veins, or something like veins, ran across its surface, pulsing with a dark fluid that wasn't quite blood. The warmth radiating from the mass was intense, like standing near a forge. Abel could smell something sweet and rotten, like meat left too long in summer heat. His stomach turned, but he forced himself to step closer. "I know you're awake," he said to the growth. "I know you can hear me." The breathing stopped. For a moment the forest went completely silent again. Then from somewhere inside the mass came a voice Abel recognized with a chill that reached his bones. "Hello, Abel. I've been waiting for you." It was Thomas's voice. His brother's voice, unchanged by 20 years of death. The same Kentucky drawl, the same gentle tone that had talked Abel through nightmares when they were boys sharing a bed in their parents' farmhouse. "You're not Thomas." Abel said. But his voice cracked on the words. Aren't I? The voice carried amusement now. I remember everything Thomas remembered. The way you taught me to whittle when I was 6. The promise you made to look after me when we enlisted. The look on your face when I died in that field hospital outside Sharpsburg. Abel's hands shook on his rifle. Thomas died of fever. I held his hand when he passed. I died because you weren't there when the Confederates overran our position, the voice continued, each word a knife twist in Abel's chest. You were off chasing glory with Colonel Morrison while I bled out in a ditch. You broke your promise, brother. That's not true. But even as Abel spoke, the denial, doubt crept in. He had been with Morrison's advance unit when Thomas's company was hit. He could have stayed, could have insisted on fighting beside his brother. Instead, he'd followed orders and left Thomas with the reserves. The growth pulsed brighter, and Abel could swear he saw movement beneath its surface, shapes that might have been fingers pressing against the membrane from within. Cut me open, Abel, Thomas's voice whispered. Let me out. We have so much to talk about. Abel drew his grandfather's knife, the blade catching the afternoon sunlight. Every instinct he'd developed in 30 years of mountain living screamed at him to walk away, to run back to his cabin and never return to this cursed place. But Thomas's voice held him like a chain, dragging up memories he'd tried so hard to bury. That's right, the voice encouraged. Just like when we were boys, and you'd cut open that old hollow log to see what was living inside. Remember? Abel did remember. He'd been 10, Thomas 8. And they'd found a rotting log behind their father's barn. Abel had used his first knife, a birthday present from their grandfather, to split the wood open. Inside had been a nest of snakes, angry and venomous, that had sent both boys running for the house. Their father had beaten Abel for endangering Thomas, and their mother had made him promise never to cut open anything he didn't understand. He was breaking that promise now. The knife slid into the growth with surprising ease, like cutting through warm butter. The moment the blade penetrated the surface, everything changed. The sweet, rotten smell became overwhelming, and a thick, black ichor began seeping from the wound. The substance was warm and moved with a life of its own, flowing up the knife blade toward Abel's hand. Deeper, Thomas's voice urged. But now it sounded different, hungrier. Cut deeper, brother. Abel obeyed, driving the blade into its full length. The growth convulsed around the steel, and the ichor began flowing freely now, pooling on the ground at the base of the dead pine. Where the black fluid touched the earth, the grass withered and died. The smell was so intense that Abel gagged, but he couldn't seem to stop cutting. The membrane split wider with each stroke, and through the opening, Abel glimpsed something that made his sanity reel. Inside, the growth was a space much larger than the external dimensions should have allowed, and that space was filled with faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed against the inner surface, like trapped souls trying to escape. He recognized some of them, fellow soldiers from his unit, Confederate prisoners he'd guarded, civilians caught in the crossfire of war, and there, among all the others, was Thomas's face. But it wasn't the peaceful expression Abel remembered from his brother's deathbed. This Thomas looked angry, accusatory, his mouth open in a silent scream of betrayal. Free us, Abel, the voices chorused now, no longer just Thomas, but all of them speaking in unison. Free us and join us. Abel jerked the knife back, but it was too late. The cut had gone too deep, and the growth was splitting open like a ripe fruit. The black ichor poured out in a torrent, and with it came something else, a presence that Abel could feel but not see. Cold and ancient and hungry, the thing flowed past him like a wind made of malice, and every blade of grass it touched died instantly. Abel watched in horror as the invisible force swept down the mountainside toward his cabin, toward Boone, toward everything he'd built in his 30 years of exile. Behind him, the growth continued to deflate, revealing the hollow interior that should have been impossible. The faces were gone now, released or destroyed. Abel couldn't tell which. What remained was a cavity carved into the dead tree's trunk, its walls covered with symbols similar to the one that had appeared near his cabin. The carvings seemed to writhe in the fading light, And Abel realized they weren't just carved, they were burned into the wood, as if branded by some unimaginable heat. A howl echoed from the valley below, Boone's voice, but twisted with terror. Abel ran toward the sound, his grandfather's knife still dripping with black ichor, leaving a trail of dead vegetation in his wake. Whatever he'd released was already at work, and his faithful companion was paying the price for Abel's curiosity. The tree behind him groaned and cracked, finally surrendering to decades of death. As it crashed to the forest floor, Abel heard one last whisper carried on the mountain wind, Thomas's voice, but now filled with malicious satisfaction. "Thank you, brother. Now the real fun begins." Abel reached the edge of the ridge and looked down toward his cabin. The structure still stood, but the trees around it were dying, their leaves turning black and falling like snow. In the yard, Boone ran in circles, chasing shadows that seemed to dart and weave around him. The dog's barks had taken on a desperate quality, and Abel could see the terror in his companion's movements. He'd made the worst mistake of his life, and now everything he'd built, everything he'd protected was in danger. The thing he'd released was connected to his past, to his guilt, to the brothers in arms he'd failed. And it was just getting started. Abel gripped his knife tighter, the black ichor still warm on the blade, and began his descent toward whatever hell he'd unleashed on his mountain sanctuary. Abel reached his cabin as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Boone met him at the porch steps, the dog's usual exuberant greeting replaced by nervous whines and constant glances toward the darkening forest. The hound's fur stood on end, and Abel noticed scratch marks on the cabin's door, deep gouges that hadn't been there that morning. "Easy." "Boy," Abel murmured, though his own nerves were frayed beyond repair. "We're going to figure this out." Inside the cabin, Abel lit every lamp he owned, driving back shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. The familiar space felt foreign now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed some of the malevolence he'd released. He cleaned his grandfather's knife methodically, but the black ichor had stained the blade, leaving dark veins in the steel that no amount of scrubbing could remove. As night fell, Abel barricaded the door and windows, using furniture and spare lumber to create barriers that felt inadequate against a threat he didn't understand. Boone refused to leave his side, pressing close whenever Abel moved about the cabin. The dog's behavior told Abel everything he needed to know. Whatever he'd unleashed was still out there, circling like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The sounds started around midnight. At first, it was just scratching, fingernails or claws dragging across the cabin's exterior walls. Abel gripped his rifle and waited, but the sounds moved in patterns too deliberate to be made by any animal. They traced the outline of the windows, tested the strength of the door, and seemed to count the number of people inside. Then came the voices. Abel. Thomas's voice drifted through the chinks in the log walls. "Why did you lock me out, brother?" "I'm cold. I'm so very cold." Abel's hands shook as he checked his rifle's load for the 10th time. "You're not Thomas. Thomas is dead. We're all dead, Abel." This voice belonged to Sergeant Murphy, his old squad leader. "Dead because of choices you made. Dead because you survived when we didn't." More voices joined the chorus. Men from his unit, Confederate prisoners, civilians caught in the crossfire of war. They spoke of battles Abel had tried to forget, of decisions that had haunted his dreams for 3 decades. Each voice was perfectly accurate, carrying the accents and mannerisms of the dead as if they stood just outside his door. Boone pressed against Abel's legs, trembling but determined to protect his master. The dog's loyalty in the face of supernatural terror reminded Abel why he'd chosen this life of isolation. Animals were honest in their affections, uncomplicated by the moral failures that plagued human relationships. By dawn, the voices had faded, but Abel knew they'd return. Whatever he'd released wasn't going to simply disappear with the sunrise. He needed answers, and there was only one place in these mountains where he might find them. Abel had heard stories of an abandoned settlement deeper in the timber country, a place where homesteaders had tried to build a life before moving on to more promising land. He'd never explored the area. It lay in the opposite direction from the trading posts where he sold his furs. But now it seemed his best hope for understanding what he was facing. The ride took most of the morning, with Boone trotting alongside Abel's horse through forests that seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the usual wildlife had fled the area, leaving only the sound of hooves on pine needles and the creak of saddle leather. Abel found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, certain that something was following them through the trees. The abandoned settlement sat in a small valley surrounded by aspen groves, their leaves already turning gold with the promise of winter. 3 log structures remained, a main house, a smaller cabin, and what might have been a barn. All showed signs of hasty abandonment rather than gradual decay. Doors hung open, personal belongings lay scattered in the yards, and the vegetable gardens had long since returned to wilderness. Abel approached the main house with his rifle ready, Boone padding silently beside him. The door stood ajar, revealing a single room that had once been someone's entire world. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, filtering through broken windows, and spiderwebs draped the corners like funeral shrouds. But it was what lay on the table that made Abel's breath catch. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, but still legible. The cover bore a name burned into the leather, Samuel Morrison. Abel opened the journal with trembling hands, and the first entry made his blood run cold. May 15th, 1863. We have claimed this land under the Homestead Act, though the Crow warned us against settling here. They speak of old curses, of things that should remain buried. Mary thinks it's superstition, but I've seen enough war to know that some places hold memory like a sponge holds water. The name Morrison sent a chill through Abel. Could this be related to his old commanding officer? He read on, each entry revealing a family's descent into nightmare. June 3rd, 1863. The children won't play near the big pine anymore. They say it whispers to them, tells them stories of battles and blood. Mary found little Sarah talking to herself yesterday, claiming to speak with the soldier man in the tree. Abel's hands shook as he turned the pages. The entries grew more disturbing with each date. July 20th, 1863. The tree has changed. Something grows upon its trunk, a mass of flesh that breathes and calls our names. The Crow elder, Joseph Running Bear, came to warn us. He says his grandfather sealed something here long ago, something that feeds on guilt and shame. He begs us to leave, but Mary refuses to abandon our claim. August 10th, 1863. Mary cut herself opening a jar yesterday and her blood fell near the tree. The growth doubled in size overnight. It knows things about us, private things, shameful things. It speaks with the voices of the dead, promising reunion with those we've lost. August 15th, 1863. I can't resist anymore. The tree calls to me with my brother's voice, James, who died at Chancellorsville fighting under Colonel Morrison's command. It promises to bring him back if I just cut open the growth, if I just release what's inside. The final entry was written in a shaking hand, August 16th, 1863. God, forgive me. I've doomed us all. The thing I released, it's not James. It's something older, hungrier. It feeds on our guilt, grows stronger with each soul it claims. Mary and the children are gone now, taken by shadows that wear familiar faces. I'm the only one left, and it's coming for me too. To whoever finds this, the Crow know how to fight it. Find Joseph Running Bear. Tell him the Morrison curse has awakened again. Tell him! The entry ended abruptly, the ink trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. Abel stared at the page, his mind reeling. Morrison, his commanding officer's name. The same officer whose voice he'd heard calling from the growth yesterday. A sound from outside made both Abel and Boone freeze. Footsteps approached the cabin, slow and deliberate. Through the broken window, Abel saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A man in a tattered Union uniform, his face pale as moonlight. "Hello, Abel," the figure called, and Abel recognized the voice of Colonel Morrison. "I see you found the journal. Quite a story, isn't it? Poor Samuel thought he could contain what his family had awakened." Abel raised his rifle, though his hands trembled with more than fear. This was his commanding officer, the man who'd led them through some of the war's bloodiest battles. But Morrison had died at Bull Run, cut down by Confederate cavalry while leading a doomed charge. "You're dead," Abel said. "I watched you die." Morrison smiled, a cold expression that had never graced the living man's face. "Death is just another posting, soldier. And I've been waiting a long time for you to join the unit." The figure began walking toward the cabin, its feet making no sound on the pine needles. Boone growled low in his throat, every muscle tensed for attack, but Abel held him back. Whatever this thing was, it wore the face of a man Abel had respected, a leader who'd saved his life more than once during the war. "Stand down, Private Cotter," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had once sent men charging into Confederate guns. "You have orders to follow." Abel felt the old reflexes kicking in, the urge to obey, to follow orders without question. But 30 years of independence had weakened those military bonds, and Boone's continuous growling reminded him that this was no reunion with an old comrade. "I don't take orders from dead men," Abel said. Surprised by the steadiness in his own voice, Morrison's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "Then perhaps you'll take them from your brother." The colonel's form wavered like heat shimmer, and suddenly Thomas stood in his place, young Thomas, dressed in his blue uniform, the one he'd been buried in. But this wasn't the peaceful Thomas from Abel's memories. This version had bullet holes in his chest and accusation in his eyes. "You let me die, Abel," Thomas said. "You chose glory over family. Now it's time to make amends." Abel clutched the journal to his chest, the leather warm against his hands. The book felt like a lifeline, a connection to someone who'd faced this horror before. Samuel Morrison, possibly a relative of the colonel, had fought this thing and lost. But he'd left clues, warnings, a path forward. The Crow knew how to fight it. Joseph Running Bear. The name appeared in the journal like a prayer. "I know what you are now," Abel said to the figure that wore his brother's face. "You're not Thomas. You're just hungry." The thing that pretended to be Thomas snarled, its features shifting into something inhuman for just a moment before snapping back to his brother's familiar appearance. "Hungry, yes," it agreed, "but patient too. I've waited 20 years for you to come home, Abel. I can wait a little longer." The figure began to fade as the sun touched the horizon, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. But its voice lingered in the gathering dusk. "Sweet dreams, brother. Think of me when you sleep." Abel was alone with Boone in the abandoned cabin, holding a journal that promised answers and a name that might represent salvation. Joseph Running Bear. If the man still lived, if he could be found, if the old knowledge hadn't died with his generation. As full darkness fell over the abandoned settlement, Abel made his decision. He would find this Crow elder, learn what the journal hinted at, and discover how to fight something that fed on guilt and wore the faces of the dead. But first, he had to survive the night. Abel spent the night in the abandoned cabin, with his back against the wall, and his rifle across his knees, listening to sounds that had no natural explanation. Footsteps circled the building, sometimes heavy like a soldier's boots, sometimes light like a child's bare feet. Voices called to him through the broken windows, Mary Morrison pleading for help, her children crying for their father, and always Thomas asking why Abel had let him die alone. Boone pressed against Abel's side. The dog's warmth a reminder that some things in this world remained real and trustworthy. Every few hours, the hound would lift his head and growl at shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Abel had learned to trust his companion's instincts, and Boone's constant vigilance confirmed what Abel already knew. They were being watched, tested, measured by something that understood human weakness better than humans understood themselves. Dawn brought silence, but no peace. Abel studied the journal by morning light, searching for any detail that might help him locate Joseph Running Bear. The entries mentioned the Crow elder visiting the Morrison settlement, warning them about the cursed land. If the man still lived, he would be ancient now. The journal was 23 years old, and Running Bear had been described as elderly even then. Abel packed the journal carefully in his saddlebags, along with what supplies he could salvage from the abandoned settlement: a tin of lamp oil, some dried beans that hadn't gone rancid, and a wool blanket that still held some warmth. As he prepared to leave, something caught his eye in the smaller cabin, a bundle wrapped in oiled deerskin, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Inside the bundle, Abel found items that made his breath catch: eagle feathers bound with sinew, a piece of red pipestone carved with symbols, and a small leather pouch filled with what looked like tobacco mixed with other herbs. The bundle smelled of sage and something else, something clean and sharp that seemed to cut through the oppressive atmosphere that had settled. Over the valley, tied to the bundle, was a note written in the same shaky handwriting as the journal's final entry: "Given to me by Joseph Running Bear for protection. Use with respect. The old ways may be our only salvation." S. Morrison. Abel had little knowledge of Indian customs, but he recognized the bundle as something sacred. The Morrison family had been given these items for protection, though they hadn't been enough to save them from the curse. Still, the fact that the supernatural presence hadn't destroyed the bundle suggested it held some power the entity feared or respected. The ride to find Joseph Running Bear would require guidance Abel didn't possess. He knew the general location of the Crow Reservation, a day's hard ride north toward the Yellowstone River, but finding one specific man among an entire tribe would be like searching for a particular pine needle. In a forest of trees, his only option was to ride to Crow Agency, the government outpost where the Indian agent maintained his office. Abel had avoided the place for 30 years, having no love for bureaucrats or their endless forms. But desperation made strange allies of former enemies. The agency sat in a broad valley where Lodge Grass Creek meandered toward the Yellowstone. A collection of wooden buildings surrounded a central parade ground where the American flag snapped in the constant wind. Abel could see Crow families camped along the creek, their teepees and canvas shelters, a reminder that even forced settlement couldn't entirely erase traditional ways. The Indian agent was a thin man named Patterson who looked at Abel with the suspicious eyes of someone who'd dealt with too many drifters and troublemakers. His office smelled of stale tobacco and bureaucratic defeat. Joseph Running Bear. Patterson consulted a ledger thick with names and numbers. "You're in luck, mountain man. He's still alive, though he's got to be near 80 by now. Lives with his grandson's family about 3 miles upstream. But I should warn you, he doesn't much care for white visitors." Abel thanked the agent and purchased supplies from the trading post: coffee, hardtack, and ammunition. The Crow families he passed regarded him with polite wariness, their eyes taking in his worn buckskins and the rifle slung across his back. He was clearly a man who lived apart from civilization, but whether that made him friend or threat remained to be seen. Joseph Running Bear's camp sat beneath a grove of cottonwoods where the creek formed a natural pool. 3 canvas tipis surrounded a central fire pit where an elderly woman tended a cooking pot. Children played at the water's edge, their laughter a sound Abel hadn't heard in years. The normalcy of the scene made the supernatural terror of the past few days feel like a fever dream. An old man sat on a blanket before the largest teepee, his long grey hair braided with strips of colored cloth. His face was deeply lined, marking him as a survivor of decades that had seen his people's world transformed beyond recognition. But his eyes were sharp and alert, missing nothing as Abel approached with his hat in his hands. "Joseph Running Bear?" Abel asked. "My name is Abel Cotter. I found something in the mountains that I believe you know about." The old man studied Abel for a long moment before speaking in accented but clear English. "The tree that breathes," he said. It wasn't a question. Abel felt relief flood through him. "Yes, I found a journal, Samuel Morrison's journal. He wrote that you warned his family, tried to help them." Joseph's expression grew somber. Samuel Morrison was a good man. His heart was pure, but his curiosity was stronger than his wisdom. Like many white men, he thought he could control what he didn't understand. "I made the same mistake," Abel admitted. I cut into the growth. I released something. Joseph nodded slowly, as if this outcome had been inevitable. My grandfather told me this day would come. The curse is patient, but it never sleeps. It calls to those who carry guilt, feeds on their shame until they serve its hunger. The old man gestured for Abel to sit beside him on the blanket. Up close, Abel could see that Joseph wore a medicine bag around his neck, similar to the bundle Abel had found in the Morrison cabin. "Tell me of your guilt, Abel Cotter," Joseph said. "What shame does the entity use against you?" Abel found himself speaking of things he'd never told another soul. The war, the decisions that had cost lives, the brother he'd failed to protect. Joseph listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if Abel's story confirmed something he'd long suspected. "The curse was not made by my people," Joseph said when Abel finished. "It is older, from the time before time when the world was different. But my grandfather learned to fight it when it first awakened, drawn by the blood of the Indian wars. He bound it to that tree, made it sleep. The white soldiers thought they had defeated us completely, but some battles they never knew they fought." Joseph reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a small pouch made from soft deerskin. "This is sacred tobacco, blessed by my grandfather and his grandfather before him. It can protect you from the entity's influence, but only if your heart is pure when you use it." Abel accepted the pouch with reverence, feeling the weight of generations in the small bundle. "How do I purify my heart?" "You must face your guilt honestly, without excuses or justification. The entity feeds on shame, but it cannot touch a man who has accepted responsibility for his actions and seeks to make amends." Joseph's eyes held depths of wisdom earned through suffering. "My people know much about guilt, Abel Cotter. We have learned that running from it only makes it stronger." As if summoned by their conversation, a cold wind swept through the camp despite the warm afternoon sun. The children stopped playing, their instincts warning them of danger they couldn't name. Boone, who had been resting by the creek, suddenly stood and began growling at the empty air. Joseph rose smoothly despite his age, his weathered hands moving to gather items from around his tipi, sage bundles, eagle feathers, and a pipe carved from red stone. "It knows you are here," he said calmly. "It knows you seek help. Tonight, we will teach you the old ways of fighting what cannot be killed by bullets." The temperature continued to drop as the sun reached its zenith, an unnatural cold that made breath visible and turned the creek's surface to ice. In the distance, Abel heard the howl of wolves, though no wolves had been seen in this valley for decades. "Your entity grows stronger," Joseph observed, lighting a bundle of sage with practiced efficiency. "It feeds on the fear of others now, not just your guilt. We must act quickly before it learns to hunt without you." As the smoke from the sage rose into the impossibly cold air, Abel realized he was no longer fighting just for his own salvation. The curse he'd unleashed threatened everyone in its path, drawing power from every moment of terror it created. The Morrison family had learned this lesson too late. Abel would not let their sacrifice be in vain. The old Crow elder began to chant in his native language, and Abel felt the sacred tobacco pouch grow warm against his chest. Whatever came next, he would face it with the wisdom of people who had fought this evil before and learned how to survive its hunger. But first, he had to learn exactly what price the old ways demanded for victory. The temperature plummeted as Joseph's chanting filled the air, his words weaving through the unnatural cold like a shield against encroaching darkness. Abel watched frost form on the grass despite the afternoon sun, and the creek's gentle babbling transformed into the cracking song of forming ice. The children had been hurried into the tipis by their mothers, leaving only Abel, Joseph, and the growing sense that something vast and malevolent was taking notice of their gathering. Joseph finished his chant and looked directly at Abel, his ancient eyes reflecting a knowledge that spanned generations. "It comes now," he said simply. "The entity knows you seek to break free of its influence. It will test us both." The first manifestation appeared as a shimmer in the air near the creek's edge, a distortion like heat waves, but moving with purpose and intelligence. As Abel watched, the shimmer began to take shape, forming into the outline of a man in a blue uniform. The figure solidified slowly, details emerging like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Private Cotter. The voice belonged to Sergeant Murphy, Abel's old squad leader, who died at Fredericksburg with a Confederate bayonet in his chest. "You're out of uniform, soldier." Abel's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but Joseph caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Bullets cannot harm what is already dead," the elder whispered. "It wears the face of your guilt to make you forget what it truly is." Murphy stepped closer, his boots leaving no marks in the frost-covered grass. The sergeant looked exactly as Abel remembered him. Stocky build, graying beard, eyes that had seen too much death to ever quite trust in life again. But when Murphy smiled, his teeth were too white, too sharp. "Look at you, hiding behind Indian superstition," Murphy said, his voice carrying the same authority it had held in life. "I trained you better than that, boy." A soldier faces his responsibilities. Other figures began emerging from the cold air. Private Henderson, who'd taken a sniper's bullet meant for Abel at Gettysburg. Corporal Williams, who died of dysentery in a field hospital. Young Billy Crawford, barely 18 when Confederate artillery had torn him apart at Antietam. All of them stood in perfect formation, their dead eyes fixed on Abel with expressions of betrayal and accusation. "You lived," Henderson said, his voice hollow as winter wind through bare branches. "We died and you lived. How's that fair, Abel?" "You had dreams," Williams added. "A future." "We had nothing but graves." Abel felt the familiar weight of survivor's guilt settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. These men had died while he'd somehow found ways to stay alive, to duck when others stood tall, to zig when others zagged. For 30 years he'd told himself it was luck, timing, the random chaos of war. But looking at their accusing faces, he wondered if some part of him had always known better. Joseph's voice cut through Abel's spiraling thoughts. "They are not your friends, Abel Cotter. They wear familiar faces, but underneath they are all the same hunger. The entity shows you what it thinks will break you." The phantom soldiers turned their attention to Joseph, and Murphy's expression twisted with contempt. "The old Indian thinks his smoke and chanting can save you. But we know the truth, don't we, Abel? We know what you did at Cemetery Ridge." Abel's blood went cold. Cemetery Ridge, a name he'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. The phantom soldiers smiled as they saw recognition in his eyes. "Tell the old man about Cemetery Ridge, Abel," Henderson urged. "Tell him about the Confederate boy who surrendered. Tell him about the rifle that went off by accident," Williams added, though his tone suggested it was no accident at all. "Tell him about the gold teeth you took before anyone found the body," Billy Crawford whispered, his boyish face wearing an expression of ancient evil. Abel's knees nearly buckled. The Confederate soldier had been barely 16, hands raised in surrender, eyes wide with terror. Abel's rifle had fired. He told himself it was a misfire, a mechanical failure brought on by rain and mud and the chaos of battle. But in the darkness of his heart, he'd wondered if his finger had tightened on the trigger out of rage, for Thomas, for all the friends this boy's army had killed. And yes, he'd taken the gold teeth, 2 perfect crowns that had bought him food and shelter during the long journey west after the war ended. "There it is," Murphy said with satisfaction. "The truth he's carried for 30 years. Not just survivor's guilt, but murderer's guilt. The old Indian's magic can't wash away blood, can it?" Joseph stepped between Abel and the phantom soldiers, his weathered hands working quickly to prepare something from his medicine bundle. "The entity feeds on your shame," he said to Abel without taking his eyes off the advancing figures. "It makes you believe that admitting guilt means accepting damnation. But my people know different. Guilt acknowledged can become wisdom. Shame-faced honestly can become strength." The old man drew out a handful of what looked like ordinary rifle ammunition, but Abel could see that each bullet had been carved with symbols and painted with red ochre. "These are spirit bullets," Joseph explained. "They cannot kill what is already dead, but they can remind your enemies what they truly are." Murphy laughed, a sound like winter wind through a graveyard. "Indian tricks won't save him, old man. The boy has tasted blood, and now he belongs to us. Joseph handed the spirit bullets to Abel. "Load your rifle," he commanded. "When I give the word, fire at the one who leads them. Aim for the heart, just as you would with any living enemy." Abel's hands shook as he loaded the carved ammunition, the red ochre warm against his fingers. The phantom soldiers watched with amusement, clearly confident that no earthly weapon could harm them. "You still don't understand, do you?" Murphy asked Abel. "We're not your enemies. We're your brothers. We're all the men you failed to save, all the men who died while you lived. Join us, and the guilt ends. Join us, and you'll never have to carry that weight again." The temptation was real and terrible. For 30 years, Abel had lived with the weight of decisions made in the chaos of war, choices that had kept him alive while better men died. The promise of release, of an end to the constant ache of survivor's guilt, was almost overwhelming. But then Boone barked, a sharp, protective sound that cut through the supernatural influence like a blade. The dog had positioned himself between Abel and the phantom soldiers, his hackles raised, his teeth bared. Whatever these things were, Boone recognized them as enemies to be fought, not brothers to be joined. "Now, Abel!" Joseph shouted. Abel raised his rifle and fired at Murphy's chest. The spirit bullet struck the phantom sergeant with a sound like thunder, and for a moment the figure wavered, its false flesh becoming translucent. Through the dissolving uniform, Abel glimpsed the thing's true form, something ancient and hungry, all teeth and shadows, an insatiable need. But Murphy reformed quickly, his mockery of humanity snapping back into place like a rubber band released. "Nice try," he said. "But you can't kill guilt with bullets, spirit or otherwise." However, something had changed. The other phantom soldiers looked less solid now, their edges blurred, as if they were having trouble maintaining their deceptions. Joseph nodded approvingly as he prepared another handful of sage to burn. "The first step is always the hardest," the elder said. "You have acknowledged your willingness to fight. Now we must teach you to see past their lies." The phantom soldiers began to circle the small camp, their movements coordinated like wolves preparing for a kill. But Abel noticed that they kept their distance from the burning sage, and whenever the smoke drifted toward them, their forms became less distinct. "They fear the sacred smoke," Joseph explained. "It reminds them of what they are not. They are not your friends, not your brothers, not even truly dead men. They are fragments of an ancient hunger wearing masks to fool you." Murphy's expression grew uglier, the human facade slipping to reveal something reptilian underneath. "The old man fills your head with lies, Abel. We know you. We remember your choices. We are the only ones who truly understand the weight you carry." "Then understand this," Abel said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I may carry guilt, but I won't carry it to the grave." "Not yet." He loaded another spirit bullet and fired, this time at Henderson. The phantom soldier dissolved more quickly, its death mask face melting away to reveal the shapeless hunger beneath. The remaining figures hissed in unison, a sound no human throat could make. Joseph smiled grimly as he added more sage to his bundle. "Good, you begin to see. But this is only the beginning, Abel Cotter. The entity has many forms, many ways to reach your heart. Tonight, when the moon is dark, it will show you its true power." As if responding to the elder's words, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and frost began forming on the inside of the teepees. In the distance, Abel heard the sound of wings, not birds, but something larger, something that had no business flying in the world of the living. Boone pressed closer to Abel's leg, the dog's courage undiminished, but his instincts warning of greater dangers yet to come. Abel checked his rifle and counted his remaining spirit bullets, knowing that the night ahead would test everything Joseph had taught him. The phantom soldiers were just the beginning. Whatever came next would require more than blessed ammunition and sacred smoke to survive. As darkness fell over the Crow camp, Joseph led Abel away from the tipis to a small hill overlooking the creek. The old man carried a leather satchel that clinked with each step, its contents mysterious but purposeful. The unnatural cold had intensified. turning their breath to vapor clouds and making the stars appear closer, sharper, as if the sky itself had contracted with malevolent intent. The entity grows stronger with nightfall, Joseph explained as they climbed. Darkness has always been its ally, making truth harder to distinguish from deception. But darkness also reveals things that daylight hides. At the hilltop, Joseph opened his satchel and withdrew an object that made Abel's pulse quicken, a compass unlike any he'd ever seen. The instrument was carved from a single piece of dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The compass needle was made from what looked like bone, yellowed with age and etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "This is the bloodstone compass," Joseph said, handling the artifact with obvious reverence. "My grandfather made it from a piece of the original curse, back when it first awakened during the Indian Wars. The needle doesn't point to magnetic north. It points to the source of spiritual corruption." Abel watched as Joseph placed the compass on a flat stone and stepped back. The bone needle spun wildly for several moments before settling into a steady direction, northwest, toward the mountains where Abel's cabin stood. But as they watched, the needle began to quiver, then swing in a slow arc toward the east. "It moves," Abel observed. "The source is moving," Joseph nodded grimly. "The entity is no longer bound to the tree you cut open. It seeks a new host, a new anchor to this world. Soon it will choose a permanent vessel, and then our chances of stopping it will diminish greatly." The implications sent ice through Abel's veins. "It's looking for someone to possess." "Not someone," Joseph corrected. "Someone specific. Someone whose guilt runs so deep that their soul provides fertile ground for its hunger. The entity has been studying you, Abel Cotter, learning your weaknesses, your regrets, your deepest shames. It wants you." As if summoned by their conversation, shapes began emerging from the darkness below. But these weren't the phantom soldiers from earlier. These were different, more personal. Abel recognized them with a stab of pain that nearly drove him to his knees. Thomas walked up the hill first, but not the angry, accusatory Thomas from the tree. This was the Thomas of Abel's fondest memories. Young, laughing, carrying the fishing pole their father had carved for his 10th birthday. Behind him came Mary, Abel's lost love, wearing the blue dress she'd worn to their last dance before the war. And behind her, impossibly, came their parents, dead these 15 years, looking exactly as they had when Abel was a boy. "Abel," Thomas called out, his voice bright with joy. "You found us. We've been waiting so long for you to come home." Mary ran toward him, her skirts swirling in the unnatural wind. "My darling," she said, her voice filled with all the love Abel had lost. "I never married your cousin. I waited for you. I've always been waiting." Abel's mother reached the hilltop and embraced him with arms that felt warm and real and achingly familiar. "My brave boy," she whispered against his ear. "You've suffered so much. Come home with us. Come home and rest." Every instinct Abel possessed screamed at him to run into their arms, to accept the forgiveness and love they offered. These weren't the harsh accusations of the phantom soldiers. This was everything he'd lost, everything he'd mourned, returned to him with perfect fidelity to his deepest longings. Joseph's voice cut through the emotional storm. "Look at the compass, Abel. See what it tells you." Abel forced his eyes away from his family's beloved faces and looked down at the bloodstone compass. The needle was spinning frantically now, its bone surface glowing with a sickly phosphorescence. Whatever these figures were, they registered as intense spiritual corruption. "They're not real," Abel whispered, though the words felt like blasphemy. "They are real," Joseph corrected. "Real as memory, real as longing, real as the love you carry for them. But they are not who they appear to be. The entity wears their faces because it knows these are the forms most likely to break your defenses." Thomas stepped closer, his boyish face creased with concern. "What's wrong, Abel? Don't you want to see us? Don't you want to come home? We could be a family again," his mother added, her eyes shining with maternal love. "All the pain, all the guilt, it could end tonight. Just come with us." Mary held out her hand, and Abel could see the engagement ring he'd given her before shipping out, a simple band with a tiny diamond that had cost him 3 months' wages. "I kept it," she said softly. "I kept it all these years, waiting for you to come back to me." The temptation was overwhelming, more powerful than any torture the entity had inflicted so far. Abel's hand moved toward Mary's outstretched fingers, drawn by a longing that had never dimmed in 30 years of exile. But Boone was growling again, the dog's instincts unclouded by human emotion. The hound could see through the deception, could smell the wrongness beneath the perfect facades. Abel forced himself to look more carefully at the figures before him. They were beautiful, perfect, exactly as his memories had preserved them. Too perfect. His mother had no grey in her hair, though she'd been greying even before the war. Thomas looked exactly 10 years old, though he'd been 20 when he died. Mary wore no lines of sorrow or aging, though she would be nearly 50 now if she still lived. "You're not them," Abel said, the words tearing at his heart even as he spoke them. "You're just wearing their faces." The figure of his mother smiled sadly. "Does it matter, my son? We offer you peace, rest from your burdens. Isn't that what you've wanted all these years?" "Peace built on lies isn't peace at all," Abel replied, remembering Joseph's words about guilt acknowledged becoming wisdom. "It's just another kind of prison." Joseph stepped forward and began burning more sage, the sacred smoke drifting between Abel and the phantoms. Where the smoke touched them, their perfect features began to blur and shift, revealing glimpses of the hunger beneath. "You begin to understand," Joseph said approvingly. "The entity offers you what it thinks you want most: reunion with the dead, escape from responsibility, an end to pain. But such gifts always come with a price." "What price?" Abel asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Your soul," Joseph answered simply. "Your will, your identity, your capacity to choose between right and wrong. The entity doesn't want to destroy you, Abel Cotter. It wants to become you." The phantom figures began to change, their loving expressions shifting to something hungrier, more possessive. Thomas's boyish face took on features that were definitely not human, while Mary's gentle smile revealed teeth that belonged in a predator's mouth. "You can't fight love, Abel," the thing wearing his mother's face said, its voice now carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "You can't fight the need to belong, to be forgiven, to find peace. We are everything you've ever wanted." Abel raised his rifle, loaded with another of Joseph's spirit bullets. "Maybe you are, but wanting something doesn't make it real." He fired at the center of the group, and the spirit bullet passed through all 3 figures simultaneously. They screamed in unison, a sound like wind through a charnel house, and their beautiful facades melted away like wax in a furnace. Beneath the false faces lay something that defied description, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that wore suggestion of human features like ill-fitting clothes. The bloodstone compass needle stopped spinning and pointed directly at the dissolving phantoms. For a moment, Abel could see the entity's true form, ancient beyond measure, fed by centuries of human guilt and shame, growing stronger with each soul it claimed. It was beautiful in its own terrible way, like a perfectly crafted weapon designed for a single purpose: to exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of the human heart. Then the vision faded, leaving only the cold wind and the distant sound of wolves that shouldn't exist in this valley. Joseph placed a weathered hand on Abel's shoulder. "Well done. You have passed the second test. But the hardest trial lies ahead. How many tests are there?" Abel asked, exhaustion weighing on him like a physical burden. "As many as it takes," Joseph replied. "The entity will not give up easily. It has invested too much time and energy in you to simply walk away. Tomorrow, it will show you its final gambit, the truth about your family's connection to this curse." Abel stared at the old man. "My family." Joseph's expression was grave. "Why do you think your grandfather's knife could cut through the entity's shell when ordinary steel would have failed? Why do you think you were drawn to that particular valley, that specific tree?" "The Morrison family wasn't the first to encounter this curse, Abel Cotter. They were just the most recent, The bloodstone compass in Joseph's hands began to glow more brightly, its bone needle pointing steadily northwest, toward Abel's cabin, toward the mountains, toward secrets that had been buried for generations. Abel realized that everything he thought he knew about his family, his past, and his reasons for coming to this wilderness was about to be turned upside down. But first, he had to survive the night. And in the distance, something was howling that sounded almost human. The howling grew closer as the night deepened, and Joseph led Abel down from the hill toward a grove of ancient cottonwoods that bordered the creek. The trees were massive, their trunks scarred by decades of wind and weather. But it was what lay hidden among their roots that made Abel's blood run cold. Bones, human bones, yellowed with age, and arranged in careful patterns around a central depression in the earth. Some were clearly Indian, decorated with beadwork and wrapped in rotting cloth, but others wore the remnants of different clothing. Wool uniforms, leather boots, and in one case, the tattered remains of a cavalry jacket with brass buttons still gleaming in the moonlight. "This is where it began," Joseph said quietly, his weathered hands moving to prepare something from his medicine bundle. "Where the first blood was spilled, where the curse took root in this land." Abel knelt beside one of the skeletons, his trained eye reading the story told by broken bones and scattered artifacts. These people hadn't died in battle. They'd been massacred, killed while unarmed, probably while sleeping. The positioning of the remains suggested a family group, parents, children, grandparents, all cut down together. My people. Abel asked, though he already suspected the answer. "My great-grandfather's family," Joseph confirmed. "Killed in the winter of 1834 by a group of white trappers who claimed this valley as their own. The leader was a man named Abel Cotter." The name hit Abel like a physical blow. Cotter, his family name, his grandfather's name. The knife at his belt, the weapon he'd used to cut open the entity's prison, suddenly felt heavier, tainted by a legacy he'd never known existed. "Ezra was my grandfather," Abel whispered. "But he died in Ohio on the family farm. He never came west." Joseph's expression was grim, but not unsympathetic. "That's what your family believed, because that's what they needed to believe. The truth was buried with the dead, hidden from wives and children who couldn't have lived with the knowledge of what their patriarch had done." Joseph moved to the center of the bone circle and began clearing away fallen leaves and debris, revealing a flat stone carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the moonlight. "After the massacre, my great-grandfather's spirit couldn't rest. The violation was too great, the injustice too profound. He called upon the old powers, the dark things that sleep beneath the earth, to ensure that justice would eventually be served." "A curse," Abel said. "He cursed my family. Not a curse, in the way white men understand such things," Joseph corrected. "A binding, a spiritual debt that would be collected when the time was right. The entity that speaks with your brother's voice, that wears the faces of your dead. It's not some random evil you awakened. It's the instrument of justice, the collector of blood debts passed down through generations." Joseph reached into his bundle and withdrew an object that made Abel's knees go weak. A bone flute, carved from what looked like a human femur, and decorated with eagle feathers and strips of fur. The instrument was ancient, its surface polished smooth by countless hands, and when Joseph held it up to the moonlight, Abel could see that it was carved with the same symbols that marked his grandfather's knife. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," Joseph said. "He carved it from the bone of his murdered son, my grandfather's father. When he played this flute, he could speak with the spirits of the dead, could call upon powers that existed before the white man came to this land." Joseph placed the flute to his lips and blew a single, haunting note. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like the cry of a dying animal, and immediately the temperature around them dropped another 10 degrees. Frost began forming on the bones scattered around the grove, and the creek stopped flowing entirely, its surface turning to black ice. "Play it," Joseph commanded, holding the flute out to Abel. "Play it and hear the truth your family tried to bury." Abel's hands shook as he accepted the bone instrument. The moment his fingers touched its surface, visions flooded his mind, images so vivid and terrible that he nearly dropped the flute in horror. He saw his grandfather as a young man, lean and hard, and filled with the casual violence of the frontier. Abel Cotter led a group of 5 trappers into this valley in the dead of winter, following rumors of rich beaver streams and untapped fur grounds. They found Joseph's family camped in the grove, peaceful people who offered hospitality to the strangers. Ezra accepted their generosity for 3 days, learning their routines, counting their weapons, measuring their defenses. Then on the 4th night, he and his men struck. They killed the men first, quickly and quietly. Then they turned to the women and children. The massacre was thorough and methodical. Ezra took scalps as trophies, claiming later that they'd been attacked by hostiles and barely escaped with their lives. His men divided the family's possessions among themselves, and they spent the rest of the winter in the valley, trapping beaver and growing rich on fur taken from streams watered by innocent blood. But one member of the Indian family survived, a boy no older than 12. Hidden by his dying mother beneath a pile of buffalo robes, he watched everything, remembered everything, and when spring came, he made his way to the Crow Nation to tell his story. That boy grew up to be a powerful medicine man, and when he died at the age of 90, he used his last breath to call the curse into being. The entity that now hunted Abel was the physical manifestation of that dying prayer, a spiritual debt collector that would not rest until justice was served. Your grandfather returned to Ohio with blood money, Joseph continued as Abel lowered the flute with trembling hands. He bought land, married your grandmother, raised children who never knew the source of their prosperity. But the debt remained unpaid, waiting for the right moment, the right descendant, the right combination of guilt and circumstance. Abel stared at the scattered bones, seeing them now not as anonymous remains, but as his victims, people his grandfather had murdered for profit, whose deaths had funded the comfortable life Abel had known as a child. "Why me?" he asked. "Why not my father or my uncle or any of the others?" "Because you came back," Joseph said simply. "You returned to the scene of the crime, drawn by instincts you didn't understand. And because you carry the specific guilt the entity needs to feed on, the guilt of a man who survived when others died, who made choices in war that echo the choices your grandfather made in this grove." The bone flute grew warm in Abel's hands, and when he looked down at it, he could see that the carved symbols were glowing with the same phosphorescent light as the bloodstone compass. The instrument was more than just a tool for speaking with spirits. It was a key, a way to unlock the binding that held the entity to this world. "You can use it to free yourself," Joseph said, reading Abel's thoughts. "The flute can break the curse, send the entity back to whatever darkness spawned it. But the price is high." "What price?" Joseph's ancient eyes held depths of sorrow that spoke of generations of suffering. To break a curse born of injustice, justice must be served. Someone from the Cotter bloodline must pay the debt your grandfather incurred. "The entity will accept no substitutes, no bargains, no half measures." Abel understood what the old man was telling him. To save himself, to end the curse that threatened to spread beyond these mountains, he would have to offer his life in payment for his grandfather's crimes. The entity would accept his death as settlement of the blood debt, and the innocent people in the nearby settlements would be safe. But first, he had to survive long enough to make that choice. And in the distance, something was approaching, through the frozen forest. Something that moved with the deliberate pace of a predator, that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. The bone flute pulsed in Abel's hands like a living heart, and he realized that his next decision would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone the curse might touch in generations to come. His grandfather's sins had created this monster, and now it fell to Abel to ensure that the cycle of violence and revenge finally came to an end. But the entity wasn't done with him yet. It had revealed the truth about his family's legacy for a reason. and Abel suspected that knowing the full scope of his grandfather's crimes was only the first part of whatever final test awaited him. The howling grew closer, and this time Abel recognized the voice behind it, his own voice, twisted by supernatural malice, calling his name across the frozen wasteland his life had become. The sound of Abel's own voice calling across the frozen landscape sent ice through his veins. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off canyon walls and pine-covered ridges, with an authority that suggested the entity had grown beyond its previous limitations. No longer content to merely wear the faces of the dead, it was now attempting to steal the identity of the living. Joseph moved with surprising speed for his age, gathering items from around the bone circle and stuffing them into a leather bundle. "It seeks to become you completely," he said, his weathered hands working with practiced efficiency. "Once it claims your voice, your form will follow, and then your soul. We must reach the sacred ground before dawn, or all is lost." Sacred ground? Abel asked, though his attention was divided between Joseph's preparations and the approaching sounds in the forest. Something large was moving through the trees, breaking branches and sending small avalanches of snow from laden pine boughs. "The place where my great-grandfather performed the original binding," Joseph replied, shouldering his bundle and motioning for Abel to follow. "The only place where the curse can be broken without requiring your death as payment. But the ritual must be performed before sunrise, and the entity will do everything in its power to prevent us from reaching it." They left the bone circle and headed deeper into the mountains, following a path that seemed to exist more in Joseph's memory than in any visible trail. Boone ranged ahead, the dog's instincts guiding them away from the sounds of pursuit that grew steadily closer. The unnatural cold had intensified until Abel's breath came in white clouds, and frost coated everything they passed, trees, rocks, even the leather of their equipment. As they climbed, Joseph began pulling items from his bundle, explaining each one's significance in the ritual they would attempt. A piece of red pipestone carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Eagle feathers bound with sinew and painted with ochre. A vial of what looked like ordinary water but smelled of sage and something else, something ancient and powerful. "These belonged to my great-grandfather," Joseph explained as they paused to rest on a rocky outcrop. "He gathered them over a lifetime of preparation, knowing that someday the debt would need to be collected. But he also knew that justice and vengeance are not the same thing, and he provided a way for the curse to be broken honorably." The ritual bundle felt heavy in Abel's hands, weighted with more than just physical mass. These objects represented generations of planning, the wisdom of a people who understood that some crimes created wounds that could only be healed through ceremony and sacrifice. But not necessarily the sacrifice of life. "What exactly did your great-grandfather bind?" Abel asked. "The entity seems too powerful, too ancient to be something he created." Joseph's expression grew grim. "He didn't create it, he summoned it, called it up from the deep places where such things sleep, offered it a contract written in blood and sealed with dying breath. The entity agreed to serve as an instrument of justice, to collect the debt owed by your grandfather's bloodline. But like all such beings, it has its own agenda, its own hungers that go beyond the original compact." A howl echoed through the forest below them. And this time Abel could hear words within the sound, his own voice, speaking phrases he'd never uttered, confessing to crimes he'd never committed, begging for forgiveness from people he'd never wronged. The entity was learning to be him, studying his voice like an actor preparing for a role. "It grows stronger with each passing hour," Joseph observed. "Soon it will be able to manifest in your exact form, and then it will be free to walk among the living, spreading its influence beyond these mountains. We must complete the ritual before that happens." They resumed their climb, following switchbacks that led ever higher into the heart of the mountain range. The trees grew smaller and more twisted as they ascended, and eventually gave way to bare rock and patches of snow that crunched beneath their boots. The air thinned until each breath required conscious effort, But Joseph pressed on with the determination of a man half his age. As they climbed, Abel found himself thinking about the choices that had led him to this moment. His decision to come west after the war, his selection of this particular valley for his cabin, even his choice to investigate the growth on the dead pine. Had any of it been truly his own decision? Or had he been guided by forces he couldn't understand? "You're wondering if you ever had free will," Joseph said, reading Abel's thoughts with unsettling accuracy. "Whether the entity manipulated you into coming here, into cutting open its prison. Did it?" Joseph considered the question as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of loose scree. The entity can influence, can whisper in the depths of dreams and guide the unconscious mind towards certain choices, but it cannot force. Every decision you made was still yours to make, even if some of those decisions served the entity's purposes. The thought offered small comfort. Abel had spent 30 years believing he'd found peace in these mountains. But now he wondered if his entire life had been nothing more than an elaborate trap closing slowly around him. They crested a ridge as the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of grey, and Abel saw their destination spread out below them, a natural amphitheatre carved into the living rock, with a small lake at its centre that reflected the stars like a mirror. The water was perfectly still, despite the wind that whipped across the exposed stone, and Abel could see that the shoreline was marked with symbols similar to those on Joseph's ritual items. "The sacred pool," Joseph said, "where my great-grandfather came to commune with the spirits of the dead, where he called the entity into being. The water comes from deep springs that have never seen sunlight, and it remembers everything that has been spoken beside it." They began the descent into the amphitheatre, but halfway down the rocky slope, Abel heard something that made his blood freeze. Footsteps behind them, matching their pace exactly, falling in perfect rhythm with their own movements. He turned to look, but saw nothing except the empty trail they'd just traversed. "Don't look back," Joseph warned. "It follows us now in your own form. To see it would give it power over your perceptions, make it harder to distinguish between reality and deception." The footsteps continued, sometimes falling slightly behind, sometimes drawing closer, but always maintaining that unsettling synchronization. Abel forced himself to focus on the path ahead, on the sacred pool that promised either salvation or final confrontation. As they reached the shoreline, Joseph began arranging his ritual items in a specific pattern around the water's edge. The red pipestone went at what Abel guessed was north, the eagle feathers at south, with other items marking the cardinal directions in a circle that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. "The ritual requires 3 participants," Joseph explained as he worked. "The seeker of justice, my great-grandfather's spirit which I will call upon. The instrument of justice, the entity itself, which will come whether we summon it or not. And the bearer of guilt, you, Abel Cotter, grandson of the man whose crimes created this debt." Boone whined softly and pressed against Abel's leg, the dog's instincts warning of approaching danger. In the growing light of dawn, Abel could see shapes moving on the ridges around the amphitheatre, dozens of figures that might have been men, or might have been something else entirely. The entity was marshalling all its power for this final confrontation. "When the ritual begins," Joseph continued, "you must enter the water holding the bone flute. The lake will show you visions of your grandfather's crimes, force you to experience them as if you had committed them yourself. You must not resist these visions, no matter how terrible they become. Only by accepting full responsibility for your family's legacy can you break the curse without forfeiting your life." Abel took the bone flute with hands that trembled only slightly. After everything he'd endured over the past few days, the prospect of facing his grandfather's crimes seemed almost manageable, almost. "And if I can't? If the guilt is too much to bear?" Joseph's ancient eyes held compassion, but no false comfort. "Then the entity will claim you as payment for the debt, and the curse will be satisfied. Either way, the threat to innocent people will end. The first rays of sunlight touched the eastern rim of the amphitheater, and the figures on the surrounding ridges began to descend toward the sacred pool. Among them, Abel could see his own face reflected dozens of times, the entity wearing his appearance like a uniform, preparing for the final battle. But there was something else moving in those ranks, something that made Abel's heart skip a beat. Thomas was there, and his parents, and Mary, not the false phantoms from before, but somehow different, more real, as if the approaching dawn had given them substance they'd previously lacked. "The dead come to witness," Joseph observed, "both those your grandfather wronged and those you've carried guilt for. In the end, all debts must be settled, all accounts balanced." Abel waded into the sacred pool, the bone flute clutched in his hands, as the army of the dead closed in around them. The water was shockingly cold, but as it rose to his waist, he began to feel something else, a presence that was vast and patient and utterly alien to human understanding. The entity had arrived for the final reckoning. The sacred pool's water reached Abel's chest as the first wave of visions struck him like a physical blow. Suddenly, he was no longer Abel Cotter standing in an alpine lake. He was Ezra Cotter, young and hard and hungry for the wealth that beaver pelts could bring. The bone flute in his hands became a skinning knife, its yellowed surface slick with blood that seemed to flow from his own memories. Through Ezra's eyes, Abel watched the massacre unfold with horrible clarity. He felt his grandfather's thoughts, shared his twisted justifications, experienced the cold calculation that turned hospitality into opportunity for murder. The Indian family had welcomed them with food and warmth, and Ezra had repaid that kindness with systematic slaughter. But this wasn't just observation. Abel could feel his grandfather's emotions as the knife fell again and again. The excitement of easy profit, the satisfaction of eliminating witnesses, the casual dismissal of human lives that didn't quite qualify as human in Ezra's mind. Worst of all, Abel felt how natural it seemed, how easily violence flowed from greed when conscience had been set aside. "No," Abel gasped, trying to pull back from the visions. But Joseph's voice reached him across the water. "Accept it," the old man commanded. "Feel what he felt. Understand what you inherited." The entity began manifesting around the pool's edge, no longer hiding behind borrowed faces. It stood 9 feet tall, its form shifting between shadow and substance, but its eyes were perfectly human, reflecting the guilt and shame of every soul it had ever consumed. When it spoke, it used Abel's own voice, but layered with harmonics that suggested vast age and bottomless hunger. "Do you see now, Abel Cotter?" the entity asked. "Do you understand what flows in your veins? Your grandfather's knife has tasted innocent blood, and now it thirsts for more." Abel looked down at his hands and saw that the bone flute had indeed become his grandfather's blade, the same weapon he'd carried into war, the same steel that had cut open the entity's prison. But now the knife was glowing with supernatural heat, its blade etched with symbols that wrote themselves in flowing script as he watched. Through the visions, Abel experienced more of Ezra's crimes. The scalps taken as trophies, the children hunted down when they tried to flee, the deliberate desecration of sacred burial grounds in search of valuable grave goods. Each act of violence fed the growing darkness in his grandfather's soul, until by the end of that terrible winter, Ezra Cotter had become something that barely qualified as human. "This is your legacy," the entity continued, circling the pool like a predator studying wounded prey. "This is the blood that bought your family's prosperity. Your grandfather returned to Ohio with gold enough to buy land, to marry well, to raise children who never questioned the source of their comfort." Abel felt the weight of that inherited guilt crushing down on him. Every meal he'd eaten as a child, every lesson he'd learned, every moment of security he'd known, all of it built on the bones of Joseph's murdered family. The war guilt that had driven him to these mountains was nothing compared to the generational debt he'd unknowingly carried his entire life. Joseph began chanting in the Crow language, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to resonate with the stone walls of the amphitheater. The ritual items around the pool's edge began to glow with their own light, creating a circle of power that held the entity at bay but did nothing to ease Abel's suffering. The visions intensified, and Abel found himself experiencing not just his grandfather's crimes, but their consequences. He saw Joseph's great-grandfather discovering the massacre, felt the old man's grief transform into rage, witnessed the terrible ritual that called the entity into being. The curse hadn't been born from malice, but from a father's love for his murdered children, a grandfather's need to see justice done, even if it took generations. "Justice," Abel whispered, the word tasting like blood on his lips. "Yes," the entity hissed, moving closer to the water's edge. "Justice delayed, but not denied. Your grandfather escaped earthly punishment, but spiritual debts cannot be evaded forever." The knife in Abel's hands grew hotter, and he realized it was changing again. The steel was becoming bone, the handle reshaping itself into something that looked disturbingly familiar. As he watched in horror, the weapon transformed into an exact replica of the flute Joseph's great-grandfather had carved from his murdered son's femur. Two flutes now, one real, one phantom, both carved from the bones of the innocent dead. Abel understood that he was being offered a choice, though the options were limited and both came with terrible prices. "Use the knife," the entity urged. "Complete your grandfather's work. Spill your own blood as payment for his crimes, and the debt will be satisfied. Or," Abel asked, though he dreaded the answer, "join with me willingly," the entity replied. "Accept my essence into your soul, become my vessel in the world of the living. Together we can collect all the debts owed by men like your grandfather. Together we can ensure that justice is never again delayed." Joseph's chanting reached a crescendo, and the water around Abel began to churn with supernatural forces. The old man was calling upon his ancestors, drawing power from generations of medicine men who had fought to maintain the balance between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. "There is a third choice," Joseph called out, his voice carrying over the wind that now whipped across the amphitheater. "But it requires more courage than either death or damnation." The entity snarled, its perfect human eyes flashing with inhuman rage. "The old man offers false hope. There are only two paths, payment or servitude." But Abel could feel something else stirring in the sacred pool, something that predated both the curse and the entity that served it. The water itself seemed alive, filled with the accumulated wisdom of every ritual performed on its shores, every prayer offered beneath its surface. Through the visions, Abel saw Joseph's great-grandfather at the moment of the curse's creation. The old man had been consumed by grief and rage, but beneath those emotions lay something deeper: love for his murdered family, hope that someday justice would prevail, faith that the world could be made right again. The curse hadn't been created to perpetuate violence, it had been created to end it. "The third choice," Abel said, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "The curse was never meant to be permanent." Joseph nodded, his weathered face brightening with hope. "My great-grandfather built a condition into the binding. If a descendant of the murderer could truly understand the weight of inherited guilt, not just acknowledge it, but accept responsibility for healing the wounds it created, then the curse could be transformed. Transformed into what?" "Forgiveness," Joseph replied simply. "Justice tempered with mercy. The debts balanced not through death, but through understanding." The entity howled with rage, its form becoming more solid and threatening. "Lies, pretty words to mask the truth. Blood debts can only be paid in blood." But Abel could feel the rightness of Joseph's words, resonating in the sacred water around him. His grandfather had committed terrible crimes, and those crimes had created wounds that echoed down through generations. But healing those wounds didn't require perpetuating the cycle of violence. It required something much harder than death. It required living with the knowledge of what had been done, and spending whatever life remained in service to those who had been wronged. Abel raised the bone flute to his lips, his hands steady now, despite the supernatural forces raging around him. The entity lunged toward the water, but Joseph's ritual circle held it back, creating a barrier of sacred power that even its ancient hunger couldn't breach. "Choose quickly," Joseph warned. "Dawn approaches, and with it, the end of the ritual window. Whatever you decide must be decided now." Abel looked at the knife flute in his hands, then at the entity whose eyes reflected his own face, twisted by supernatural malice. Finally, he looked at Joseph, whose ancestors had paid the price for his grandfather's crimes, but who still offered the possibility of redemption. The choice, when it came, felt inevitable. Abel placed the bone flute to his lips and began to play, though he'd never learned how to make music from such an instrument. The notes that emerged weren't his own. They flowed from some deeper knowledge, guided by the spirits of the dead who surrounded the sacred pool. The melody was haunting and beautiful, a lament for all the innocent lives lost to violence and greed. As the music rose into the dawn air, the entity's howls of rage transformed into something else, a keening wail that might have been grief, or recognition, or the sound of ancient bonds finally beginning to loosen. The creature's form wavered, becoming less solid, as if the flute's song was unmaking the very foundations of its existence. "I accept responsibility," Abel said, his voice carrying clearly across the water, "not just for my own crimes, but for the crimes of my bloodline. I accept the debt my grandfather created, and I offer myself not as payment, but as instrument of healing." Joseph began a new chant, this one softer, more hopeful than the binding words he'd spoken before. In his weathered hands appeared a pipe carved from red stone, a sacred instrument that Abel recognized from the stories he'd heard about Indian peace ceremonies. The pipe's bowl was filled with the same mixture Abel had seen in the tobacco pouch. But now he understood its true significance. "The peace pipe," Joseph explained, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "My great-grandfather made this during his final years, when grief had given way to wisdom. He knew that vengeance alone could never heal the wounds that had been inflicted, and he prepared this as an offering to the spirits, a way to transform the curse if the right conditions were ever met." The entity's form continued to waver, caught between its supernatural rage and the growing power of the ceremony. For moments, it appeared as the hungry shadow Abel had come to know. Then it would shift to reveal glimpses of what it had once been, the spiritual embodiment of a father's love for his murdered children. Corrupted by decades of feeding on guilt and shame. "Use the pipe," Joseph instructed. "Offer smoke to the four directions, to the spirits of earth and sky, to the dead who cannot rest, and the living who must carry their memory forward." Abel waded to the pool's edge, where Joseph waited with the pipe. The sacred instrument felt warm in his hands, as if it had been resting near a fire rather than lying cold in the dawn air. As he lifted it to his lips, the bone flute in his other hand began to resonate in harmony, the two instruments creating music that seemed to reach beyond the physical world. The first puff of smoke rose straight into the still air, carrying with it Abel's prayers for the murdered family whose bones still lay in the cottonwood grove. The second carried his acknowledgement of his grandfather's crimes and his own complicity in benefiting from them. The third carried his promise to spend whatever years remained to him in service to those who had been wronged. The fourth puff never rose at all. Instead, it spread across the water's surface like morning mist, and in that mist, Abel saw faces beginning to form. Not the false phantoms the entity had shown him, but the real spirits of the dead, Joseph's family, come to witness the ceremony that would finally grant them peace. Among them stood a figure Abel recognized from the visions, the old medicine man who had created the curse, Joseph's great-grandfather. But this spirit showed no trace of the rage and grief that had driven him to call darkness into the world. Instead, his ethereal face reflected a deep sadness tempered by hope, the expression of a man who had learned that justice and mercy were not opposing forces but partners in the dance of true healing. The entity let out one final wail as the pipe smoke reached its wavering form. For a moment, it fought against the transformation, clinging to the anger and hunger that had sustained it for so many years. But the music of the flute and the prayers carried by the sacred smoke were unmaking its very essence, revealing the love and loss that lay beneath its monstrous exterior. "Let go," Abel said to the creature, and his voice held not command but invitation. "Let go of the anger. Let the love that created you transform you back into what you were meant to be." The entity's form began to change, its shadowy substance becoming lighter, more ethereal. The rage in its eyes gave way to something that might have been relief, and when it spoke again, its voice was no longer layered with supernatural malice, but filled with the simple grief of a father who had lost his children. "They were so young," the spirit said. Its words carried on the wind that swept across the sacred pool. "My son, my daughter, my grandsons, they had done nothing to deserve such cruelty." "I know," Abel replied, tears streaming down his face as he felt the full weight of his family's legacy. "I know, and I'm sorry. I can't bring them back, but I can ensure their deaths meant something. I can make sure their story is remembered, their lives honored." Joseph stood at the pool's edge, the peace pipe smoking gently in his hands, his ancient face reflecting decades of wisdom earned through suffering. "This is how true justice is served," he said. "Not through endless cycles of vengeance, but through acknowledgement, responsibility, and the commitment to do better." The spirits of the dead began to fade as the sun crested the eastern peaks, but their faces showed peace now instead of the restless hunger that had driven them to seek revenge. Joseph's great-grandfather nodded once to Abel, a gesture that seemed to convey both forgiveness and expectation. The debt was acknowledged. But the work of healing was just beginning. The entity that had terrorized the mountains for so many years dissolved completely as the last of the pipe smoke dissipated. In its place stood a figure that was translucent but unmistakably human, the spirit of Joseph's great-grandfather as he had been in life, before grief had twisted his love into a weapon of vengeance. "The curse is broken," the spirit said, its voice carrying the authority of one who had learned the difference between justice and revenge. "But the responsibility remains. You carry our story now, Abel Cotter. You carry the truth of what was done and the obligation to ensure it never happens again." Abel nodded, understanding that this was not an ending but a transformation. The supernatural threat was gone, but in its place lay a deeper challenge. The work of living with inherited guilt while choosing to serve healing rather than perpetuating harm. As the spirits faded with the growing daylight, Abel found himself standing in ordinary water under an ordinary sky, holding instruments that were no longer supernatural weapons, but simple tools of ceremony and remembrance. The bone flute remained warm in his hands, a reminder of the price of violence. The peace pipe smoke still rose into the morning air, carrying prayers for healing that would need to be offered daily for the rest of his life. Joseph waded into the pool and embraced Abel, the old man's strength surprising after the trials of the night. "Welcome to the family," he said quietly. "Not the family of blood that brought you here, but the family of choice that will carry you forward." Boone barked from the shore, the dog's tail wagging as he sensed that the supernatural threat had finally passed. The hound's simple joy reminded Abel that some bonds transcended guilt and responsibility, loyalty freely given, love without conditions, the possibility of peace even in the shadow of inherited sin. As they made their way out of the sacred pool, Abel realized that his real journey was just beginning. The curse was broken, the entity transformed back into the love that had created it. But the work of healing the wounds left by his grandfather's crimes would take a lifetime to complete. It was work he was finally ready to undertake. 3 months later, Abel stood beside the rebuilt marker that now properly honored the Crow family murdered by his grandfather. The stone monument bore their names in both English and Crow syllabics, carved with the same care that Abel had once reserved for rifle maintenance and trap construction. At its base lay offerings, eagle feathers, sacred tobacco, and small personal items that visitors had left to honor the dead. The work had taken most of the summer, But it represented only the beginning of Abel's commitment to healing the wounds his family had created. With Joseph's guidance, he'd learned the proper protocols for honoring the dead, the ceremonies that kept their memory alive, and the responsibilities that came with carrying such painful history forward. The marker stood in a small clearing where Abel had built a simple cabin, not for himself, but as a place where Joseph's descendants could come to remember their ancestors and where others could learn the true history of what had happened in this valley. The old cabin where Abel had lived for 30 years remained, but it felt different now, less like a hiding place and more like a foundation for the work ahead. Boone lay in the shade of a young pine tree Abel had planted near the memorial, the dog's graying muzzle resting on his paws as he watched his master tend to the flowers that had been planted around the monument. The hound had recovered fully from his ordeal with the supernatural entity, but something in his eyes suggested he understood the gravity of what they'd all been through. There was wisdom in his gaze now, the deep contentment that came from surviving a test that revealed the true measure of character. In his shirt pocket, Abel carried a smooth river stone, worn smooth by decades of mountain streams, unremarkable except for its perfect weight in his palm. Joseph had given it to him on the day after the ceremony, calling it a memory stone, something to hold when the past threatened to overwhelm the present. It served as a reminder that truth, however painful, was always preferable to the comfortable lies that allowed guilt to fester in darkness. The stone had become Abel's daily companion, a touchstone that kept him grounded when the work of reconciliation felt overwhelming. There were days when the weight of inherited guilt pressed down like a physical burden, when the magnitude of his grandfather's crimes seemed too vast for any single person to address. On those days, the memory stone reminded him that healing happened one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of service at a time. Joseph approached through the trees, moving with the careful grace of a man who had learned to honor his aging body while refusing to surrender to its limitations. At 78, he had become not just Abel's teacher, but his closest friend, the bridge between the guilt of the past and the possibility of redemption in whatever years remained. "The agency wants to bring a delegation next month," Joseph said, settling onto a wooden bench Abel had built facing the memorial. Government officials, tribal leaders, some historians from the university. They want to hear the story, make it part of the official record. Abel nodded, though the prospect of sharing the tale with strangers still felt daunting. For months, he'd been working with Joseph to document everything. His grandfather's crimes, the curse that followed, the ceremony that had finally brought peace to the restless dead. The story needed to be preserved, not just as history, but as a warning about the long-term consequences of violence and injustice. "Will you speak with them?" Joseph asked. "If it serves the purpose," Abel replied. "If it helps prevent something like this from happening again." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the shadows lengthen as the afternoon sun moved toward the western peaks. This had become their routine, meeting at the memorial each evening to tend the flowers, check the offerings, and sometimes just sit with the weight of what had been lost and what had been found. The work Abel had undertaken extended beyond the memorial itself. He'd spent weeks cataloging his grandfather's belongings, searching for any other artifacts that might carry spiritual significance. Several items had been returned to the Crow Nation: a beaded necklace that had belonged to one of the murdered women, a child's moccasins that still bore traces of their young owner's footsteps, a medicine bundle that Abel's grandfather had taken as a trophy, but never understood. Each returned item felt like a small weight lifted from his shoulders. Though Abel understood that the work of restitution would never be completely finished, some debts could only be paid through a lifetime of service, through the choice to spend whatever years remained in humble acknowledgement of inherited responsibility. "I've been thinking about winter," Abel said, pulling the memory stone from his pocket and turning it over in his weathered hands. "About what comes next when the snows close the mountain passes," Joseph nodded thoughtfully. "The work continues regardless of season, Perhaps that's when the real test begins, maintaining commitment when no one else is watching, when there's no ceremony to guide your steps. The old man was right, as he usually was. The dramatic confrontation with the supernatural entity had been terrible but brief. The daily choice to honor the dead through service would require a different kind of courage. The quiet heroism of consistent action over years and decades. "I want to start a school," Abel said. The words emerging from thoughts he'd been carrying for weeks. Nothing fancy, just a place where young people can learn the real history of this valley, where Crow children can hear their ancestors' stories and white children can understand the consequences of their ancestors' choices. Joseph's face broke into a smile that transformed his weathered features. "My great-grandfather would have liked that idea. He always believed that education was the key to preventing future tragedies." As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, other figures began appearing in the clearing. Joseph's family came first, his grandson Thomas and his great-granddaughter Sarah, who had become Abel's most eager students in learning the proper ceremonies for honoring the dead. Behind them came other members of the Crow community, people who had initially viewed Abel with suspicion, but had gradually come to accept his sincere commitment to making amends. The evening ritual was simple but profound. Each person placed a small offering at the base of the memorial, a flower, a smooth stone, a pinch of sacred tobacco. Then they stood in a circle around the monument while Joseph spoke the names of the dead, ensuring that each victim was remembered not just as a casualty of violence, but as an individual with dreams, fears, loves, and losses. When the ceremony concluded, the group lingered in the gathering dusk, sharing stories, and sometimes just enjoying the peace that had settled over this place that had known such terrible suffering. Children played at the edge of the clearing while their parents spoke in quiet voices about plans for the coming seasons, about the school Abel wanted to build, about the ongoing work of healing that would outlast all of them. Abel watched it all with a contentment he'd never expected to feel. The guilt remained. It would always remain, a permanent weight that reminded him of the cost of violence and indifference. But alongside the guilt lived something new: purpose, community, the knowledge that even inherited sin could be transformed into a force for healing. As the evening stars appeared in the darkening sky, Abel realized that his journey had come full circle. He'd fled to these mountains seeking isolation and peace, only to discover that true peace could only be found in community, in acknowledging the connections that bound all people together across generations and cultures. The memory stone felt warm in his hand as he made his way back to his cabin, Boone padding silently beside him through the familiar forest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to honor the dead through service to the living. There would be days when the work felt overwhelming, when the magnitude of inherited guilt threatened to crush his resolve. But tonight, as Abel prepared for sleep in a cabin that no longer felt like a hiding place, he found himself looking forward to whatever tomorrow might bring. The curse was broken, the dead were at peace, and the living had been given another chance to choose healing over harm. It was enough, more than enough. It was the beginning of whatever redemption looked like for a man who had learned to carry truth instead of running from it, who had discovered that even the darkest inheritance could be transformed through the daily choice to serve something larger than himself. The memory stone sat on his bedside table as Abel drifted off to sleep, a tangible reminder that the past could be acknowledged without being perpetuated, that guilt could become wisdom, and that love, in the end, was always stronger than vengeance.